chiseled abs, peaky biceps, and physiques that seem out of this world.
Gymnasts get phenomenal results physically, even though they're not necessarily training for them.
Gymnasts are incredibly well-rounded athletes with insane body coordination, mobility, and strength, with physiques that are in some cases comparable to that of natural bodybuilders. But how are they so incredibly buff despite doing a sport that also relies heavily on being light and mobile? Is it their genetics, the training regimen, or do gymnasts also hold a secret on how they're able to pack on so much muscle and stay lean throughout their entire competitive careers? You see, in men's gymnastics, you have 6 events in total that you have to be good at, all of which require their own specific skills and physical strength to be proficient at. 4 of those events are primarily dependent on your upper body strength and mobility, and they all have lots of specific skills underneath them that you have to be able to perform, most of which are not exactly easy. However, there is one event in particular which really puts muscular strength to the test, and that is the rings event. Here, you do not only have to hold insanely difficult and taxing positions, but virtually every movement you do puts your elbow flexors at some strain. And skills like the iron cross require a ton of force produced from a lot of different muscles at once. Hence why these gymnasts often end up with so well-defined and developed overall musculature, especially in the upper body, like their lats, their chest, the shoulders, and especially the core. So they essentially spend most of their time on those 4 events which target most of the upper body. And even if they are only working with their body weight on these, the skills are just so difficult to perform that there's always a few muscles getting a good stimulus for muscle growth at some point. But first, a big thank you to today's video sponsor at Hume Health. I don't know about you guys, but I tend to weigh myself every single day, and I want the most reliable scale for that exact purpose. And Hume's latest product, the Hume Pod, fits that role perfectly. It's not only a highly reliable scale, but it's also a full body analyzer that can help you track progress more in detail. Now, normally I am very critical of these things, but unlike most products out there, the Hume Pod has actually been tested to be 98% as reliable and accurate as the famous InBody scan. It's connected to an app that helps you keep track of your sleep, your dietary habits, your weight, everything, and it gives you feedback on areas that you can improve. Now, if you want to make the most of this product, I would highly advise you to weigh yourself early in the morning fasted to make the measurements more reliable. And that will make it a lot easier to track things like your weight, your body composition, and your level of hydration. So as with every tool like this, including the DEXA scan, you have to make sure that your weigh-ins and measurements are actually valid and reliable. And that way, your feedback will also be a lot more accurate. Tracking your weight alone is great, but tracking everything will give you a better outlook on how you are progressing. So if you want to track your progress with more accuracy, head over to Hume Health, or you can scan the QR code on your screen right now. And of course, make sure you use the code BADGUY at checkout for upwards of 50% off the entire product with the ongoing sale. Now back to the video. This is American gymnast and former Olympian Jake Dalton, and frankly, he has one of the craziest physiques I've ever seen on an athlete. But one thing that immediately stands out for anyone watching are his arms, specifically his biceps, which are incredibly massive. But there is also one thing about Dalton that isn't so clear at first. He's only 5'6" or 168 centimeters tall, and with shorter arms and bicep bellies which attach very low on the tendon, his arms ultimately look a lot rounder and fuller as a byproduct. If you pack a lot of muscle onto a tiny space, it will essentially look a lot better or fuller than if you spread it out a bit more. And you can also see this with pro bodybuilders like Phil Heath or Lee Priest. But in gymnastics, having short arms can actually be very beneficial on certain events like the rings. And with gymnasts on average being pretty short, their physiques also pop a lot more as a byproduct. But this is not the primary reason for why gymnasts look so muscular. The average Olympic gymnast has in excess of 1,500 training hours per year, where most of that time is centered around upper body training and getting as good as possible at difficult skills. It is no wonder that the insane training volume adds up over time. And don't get me wrong, gymnasts also do a lot of strength training on the side, like weighted dips, pull-ups, hanging leg raises, handstand push-ups, and lots more, often with a really complete range of motion. And many also do isolation movements on top of this. So a huge part of why why they end up looking so muscular actually just comes down to the fact that their total weekly training volume is absolutely insane. They're not just hitting their upper body twice per week like a recreational lifter or a gym bro would, they are doing high skill, high tension work on those same muscles day after day, year after year for many years to get a professional career. Every swing, hold, press, and strength element is essentially another way to expose yourself to some degree of mechanical tension. And because these movements are so complex, they end up accumulating a ton of effective reps almost by accident. Not because they're necessarily chasing a pump, in fact they tend to do the opposite, but because that is what's required to execute the sport at a high level. As the primary driver of muscle growth is mechanical tension, when you do so much, you are essentially pushing yourself on all of these movements, you will accumulate a lot of it, even if it's not the most time-efficient way to grow muscle. And here's something a lot of people do not realize. Because despite doing most things with just their body weight, gymnasts are absolutely implementing progressive overload, which is the principle of increasing difficulty to continuously adapt to the stimulus your muscles receive. They are just not doing it by adding loads as they get stronger. Instead of loading a movement with more weight, they increase the difficulty of the movement itself. They make the levers longer, they remove points of contact, they might move the center of mass further away from the joints, and they turn what used to be a manageable exercise into a much harder variation. And in competitions, they get rewarded for doing so. If you think about it, that is essentially the same thing as adding weight to a lift. If you go from a regular dip to maybe a ring dip to a strict Korean dip and then something like ring Maltese work, the force requirements skyrocket even though the external load itself hasn't actually changed. The resistance comes from leverage. That is literally progressive overload, but it's applied through movement difficulty. On top of all this, there is a huge selection bias, and when it comes to looking at what we think of as the gymnast physique. The average guy who signs up for recreational gymnastics and doesn't have those same leverages, those muscle belly insertions, and not necessarily the responsiveness to training all that much, he is not going to make it to the Olympic finals, and he is not going to look like Jake Dalton. The guys you see on the world stage are already genetic outliers. They are short, they have compact frames with very favorable proportions for many events. They have dense muscle bellies and nervous systems that can tolerate ridiculous training loads without breaking down. So when you scroll through a clip of an Olympic level gymnast and you think that, oh, this is just what gymnastics will do to the human body, you're not wrong, but you're also really just seeing the best physiques from the 0.1 top percent of responders who also survived that brutal training pipeline. And just to add to that, a lot of these pictures circulating the internet are edited to make them appear even more impressive. Like, apparently this doesn't get the point across, so somebody had to make it look like this. Now, that doesn't mean that gymnastics cannot build muscle for normal people. It absolutely can, and it does. It'll essentially make you better at a lot of different movements, build great general upper body strength, and at an amateur level, it's a very healthy sport and endeavor. But it does mean that the physiques you're seeing at the Olympics are not a realistic expectation of everyone who touches a pair of rings. They are the end product of years of being very specific with their training, high volume training layered on top of already having elite genetics. So when you combine that extreme training volume, the demanding skills that force you to spend a lot of time in those high tension positions, you might have some smart supplemental strength work on the side, and the fact that only the most gifted athletes make it all the way through, you will end up with physiques like these. And one thing to remember is that the history of gyms actually started with gymnastics clubs, which later evolved into new ways of moving your body with weights. So a lot of the top level physiques from over 100 years ago were mostly built using gymnastics equipment or just their own body weight. The dip bar or pull-up bar are essentially just offspring from the regular parallel bars and horizontal bars that most gymnasts use. Now, there's also a darker side to all of this that we don't really see on the highlight reels. Most elite level gymnasts maintain a very low level of body fat, because being lighter in gymnastics makes it easier to rotate, makes it easier to swing or hold those brutal positions. The only downside is that staying very lean while doing an insane amount of training can be very demanding on the body long term and hard to sustain. On top of that, the injury rate in gymnastics is insanely high, and many gymnasts have very short careers because their bodies simply cannot handle that kind of stress forever. and most of this starts at a very young age. A lot of gymnasts start training very seriously at around age 6, which means they've already built a noticeable amount of muscle and crazy coordination even before they hit puberty. So by the time you see a 17 or 18-year-old gymnast on the international stage with a ridiculous physique, then they have already been training for over a decade. And of course, there's always the argument that most high-level athletes are on PEDs even if they are tested. Although it's speculative, it's definitely worth mentioning that these type of physiques at the Olympic level might not be clean, even if gymnasts are less often caught than in other sports like track and field, weightlifting and cycling, because their sport has such a high skill demand. All of that is worth mentioning because while their physiques look amazing and their strength is incredible, the path they take to get there is not necessarily healthy or remotely sustainable for the average person. Their physiques are built on huge training volumes, lever-based progressive overload, early specialization, and a willingness to tolerate those risks, which is fine if your goal is to become an Olympic level gymnast, but it's probably not what most people should aim for to copy one-to-one. Can you still build a great physique by doing just calisthenics and such? Absolutely, but the bar is definitely much higher on those sports compared to just joining a gym, where there is a lot more exercise availability and you can easily adjust the load based on your level. So in general, gymnasts have great physiques, but they are often biased due to their great genetics on top of the requirements of being a top-level gymnast. Their training is so difficult that they ultimately build a huge amount of muscle as a byproduct of trying to be as proficient as possible on a lot of skills. And many start very young, usually hitting their peak at around age 20. Is it the best training for hypertrophy? No, but there is a lot to be learned from these athletes and the principles that you can implement into your own training, even if you are just a regular gym bro trying to build some mass. But what do you guys think? Do you have any crazy stories about gymnasts, or have you tried gymnastics yourself? I actually did at some point, and as a powerlifter, safe to say it didn't go over that well. And I will leave the link to that video on your screen right now if you want to check it out. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.